and sisters. This is Dr. William Sneblin coming to you from With One Accord Ministries with another Treasure Guardians teaching. This one is about the upcoming feast of Pesach, Passover, and also about the calendar of the Creator. Now, as many of you may know, there's a fair amount of controversy back and forth about the exact calendar that the people of Yahweh should be following. And of course, you may have heard the joke that if you go into a room full of 3 Jews, there's 4 opinions. And that's kind of what we've got here. And so what I'm about to present is the result of many years of studying and trying to make sense of all this in a way that will hopefully edify the people of Yahweh and also will give you some idea of how to proceed. Now, here's the problem. We know up front that it was prophesied in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, that the enemies of Yahweh would endeavor to mess around with the calendar, with the days and the times and so on. We read there in Daniel 7:27, and he shall speak, meaning the enemy, the anti-Messiah, whatever, shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change times and laws. So we understand that there has been a concerted effort on the part of Ha-Satan and on the part of his minions within the Roman Church, etc., to confuse and deceive this vital issue. So here's what we got. The problem is that today we are using a essentially Roman calendar. Many people don't even know that, but it's called the Gregorian calendar. And before we were using that, back nearly 2 millennia ago, we were using what was called the Julian calendar, and that also is Roman, and that was based upon edicts put forth by Julius Caesar. Now, this calendar that we're using today is comparatively modern. It's from the 1500s, and it was put out by Pope Gregory to correct. There were really serious problems with the Julian calendar. And so this calendar was put forward in an effort to correct some discrepancies, and these were massive. I mean, we got to realize, first of all this was done without the guidance of the Ruach HaKodesh, the set-apart spirit, and of course also without the modern, scientific instruments that we have today. So because of that, we had a real problem there. And so this Pope, Gregory, he decided to just sort of unilaterally change the calendar again. And this caused some rather bizarre things to happen because remember, this was back in 1582 is when this was first issued. So we're talking just really a little over a century after the discovery of America. And what the problem was is that it took years for these edicts to make their way around first of all, the Western world, Europe and the New World. For example, it hit finally in America in 1752. So, it took a while because there was controversy about this, and especially because in America, of course, in the first, century or so of the colonization of this land, the people here were predominantly Protestants, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, gradually it came about. But because of this, for example, in the United States, well, actually it would have been in the colonies, they actually had a month, September, where they skipped from September 2nd to September 14th. So they literally threw out a third of the month just to make everything line up. Now, because of all of this tweaking, all this tinkering, it's almost impossible for people who and of course, all through this time, the Jewish people were trying to keep the feasts and trying to keep the Sabbath amidst all this back and forth, this and that and the other thing. And I think it's really almost impossible to think that over all this time and losing almost a third of a month in that year here in the American colonies, that that we still know when these dates are. It's just not at all likely. So given that, this is the problem. Then we have the fact that the rabbis, when Jerusalem was leveled, and and later on in the early second century, when all the Jewish people were forced to leave Israel, and the Roman government renamed it Palestine at that time. It was never called that until Rome did that again. Rome is always the fly in the ointment here, as we will see. But in any event, what happened is that they decided to set up a calendar that was no longer connected to the land of Israel, because they couldn't be in the land of Israel. And the problem, which is actually a few centuries earlier, is the fact that when the history shows that when the Jewish people went to Babylon for 70 years, and then they came back, and that would have been, that would have been around 538 BC, when the Jewish people came back to the land, they brought with them this Babylonian lunar calendar. Because, imagine, if you lived somewhere where the Babylonians were the dominant culture in the world at that time, kind of like America is the superpower today. Well, the Babylonians were the superpower back then in the whole Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. And so if people lived and died, because of course generations were not that long back then as they are now, never knowing the land of Israel, never knowing Yahweh's calendar. And so when they moved back to Israel, they brought back with them this lunar calendar. And by that I mean that the idea that the months begin with the new moon, or the first sliver of the waxing moon. So this is actually Babylonian. Nowhere is it in the Bible. In fact, the funny thing is that if you actually study the Torah, you'll find no evidence in the 5 books of Moses of any kind of lunar calendar whatsoever. Now, that's important to remember, because many people, both Jewish people, people that are devout Israelite, Jewish, rabbis and so on, they are keeping this lunar calendar with months that are actually named after Babylonian names. Like, for example, there is actually a month in the Jewish calendar today that's called Tammuz. And anybody that knows the Bible really well knows that in Ezekiel 8, we read about Tammuz being a pagan deity. And so they have these various months named Nisan and Tammuz and so on that are actually Babylonian names. And that's why most Nazarene, people who follow Yahushua, we don't even use those names. We just, the only month in Yahweh's calendar that is named is the first month, which is Abib, the very first month. Otherwise, we just say second month, third month, fourth month, and so on. Keeps things simple. So with that in mind, understand that there's no evidence in the Torah of there being any lunar calendar. Now, some people might say, well, if you go further, if you look in some of the other books of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Scriptures, you will see references to a new moon, or what is translated in the King James Bible and most other Bibles, including Hebrew Bibles, as the new moon. And the word there is Rosh Hodesh. Now, the example of that would be in 1 Samuel 20, verse 5, and several other places. And so from that, you see, since that's translated new moon, both the rabbis and the vast majority of Christian commentators will say, oh, well, they had a lunar month. Well, here's the problem. The word moon is not in there. The word, just to take it apart, the word Rosh means head. So it's like the head of the month, the beginning of the month, or if you will, the beginning of the moon. But the word Chodesh is not the Hebrew word for moon. The word for moon in Hebrew is Yeriach. which sounds nothing like Chodesh. You will find, if you go through the either Young's or Strong's concordances, you will find that in many places the word Chodesh is used for month, not for moon. Whereas on the other hand, if you just see, like for example, the first time the word moon is mentioned in the Torah, it's Yeriach, and that is how it's used many other places. Whereas there are literally dozens of places in the Hebrew scriptures where Chodesh is used to mean month. So, because of that, I would submit to you that the idea that the months begin with the new moon, or the first sliver after that, is not scriptural. It really isn't. It's a nice try, but it fails. Now, here's the thing. There are these Babylonian influences that we want to try and get out. It's kind of a sort of leaven, if you will, pardon the pun, considering we're entering the season of Passover. But it's important that we don't, just like, we don't allow pagan feasts like Christmas and Easter into our lifestyle. So in the same way, we need to be sure we're not following a pagan Babylonian calendar. So, the funny thing is, if you actually look in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, we are told in Genesis 1:16 that Yahweh designated the sun to rule over the day, and the moon, is actually called the greater light and the lesser light, but we understand what that means, to rule over the day, and then the lesser light, the moon, to rule over the night. That doesn't seem too hard. The interesting thing is that if we go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls documents, there's a document that was discovered, and I think most listeners understand what the Dead Sea Scrolls were, where it says, this is in 4Q 216, talks about the sun being put in charge of all the years, the Sabbaths, and the Moedim, the feast days. So that's something to bear in mind. The Torah tells us right in the Ten Commandments, that we should remember the Sabbath day to keep it set apart. Now, what does that mean? Well, it says day. It doesn't say night. It says day. And we need to explore this because this is kind of important. There are things that are in the practices of our Jewish brethren that are not always scriptural. Now, if the Sabbath day is what we're supposed to remember, why would we use the night light, so to speak, the light of the moon, to determine feast days and Sabbaths? It doesn't make a lot of sense. See, you got to understand something. The ancient Israelite people, like most people back then, looked at the word day as being the time when it was light, when you could travel, or you could go to work, or you could go out in the fields and labor, or have your flocks out, or whatever it might be. That was the day. I mean, pretty much cut and dried. And even our master Yahushua says this. In John 11, verse 9, he says, "Are there not 12 hours in the day?" Referencing the time that we are active and go out and work. Because, back then there was no electricity. Basically, people just, when it got dark, they came home and they went to sleep, unless they had some kind of, candles or whatever to study, the scriptures with. So, even in creation, now this is important. In Genesis 1, we read this. A day is repeatedly defined as the evening and the morning, starting in verse 5. Now, people might say, well, isn't the evening the night? No, it isn't. Those are two entirely separate Hebrew words. The word for evening is arev, and the word for night is lail. So again, no resemblance between those two words. And, nowadays we kind of think of evening as being sort of the twilight, whatever, and that's not entirely what they thought of in those days. Because again, the night is defined in that same verse as being the time of darkness. And, evening, it's still not dark. In the evening, you can still walk around, you can still see things. And you need to understand in the ancient Hebrew way of thinking, this was before we had mechanical clocks. That basically in those days, people used the sun to tell time during the day and the moon and stars to tell time during the night. And it wasn't a precise science. And they would be out in their fields, and they might have to walk a ways to get home. And so as they would observe the sun going down, maybe what today we would think of as like 3 o'clock-ish, somewhere in there, they would start heading home because they didn't want to be out walking around in the dark. They certainly didn't want to be, getting lost or anything like that. And so it's important to understand that they looked at the evening as being more or less mid to late afternoon. And it's interesting that if you actually look in the Hebrew scriptures, there is no word in Hebrew for afternoon. And people might say, well, there is that one place, it's in Judges 19:8, where the word afternoon is used in the King James Bible, and probably a lot of other Bibles as well. But the thing is, if you translate that word, if you look at what it is in the Hebrew, the word there is yom, which as many people know is just the word for day. So the idea, if you kind of drill down into the Hebrew, is that the word yom means the hottest part of the day. And of course, we see that to this very day. Typically, I don't care where you live, a temperate climate or tropical climate, the afternoon is the warmest part of the day, usually, barring some bizarre cold front or something coming in. So, that's the idea. So the day is the morning and the evening, not the night. So you can't even usually see the moon in the evening until later on in the afternoon. Sometimes you can, depending on the situation, but it's important to realize this. Now, the other problem that's more practical about using a lunar calendar is finding the sliver of the new moon. I mean, I followed this practice for the whole first probably 16 years of my trying to really be obedient to what I thought was the commandments. And every year there was this big thing because, first of all, there was the whole thing about the Karaite idea that you have to have the barley be in a certain point of ripeness. And then there was the whole thing of who's going to find the moon? Is there clouds over Israel? Is it the moon over Israel, or is it the moon over, like, say, New York or Chicago or London? So there was all of this stuff, and of course most people said, well, it's got to be Jerusalem because that's where Yahweh placed his name, and that's fine. But the problem is that many times there were clouds, and so then they'd wait a day to declare the new moon. They'd have to wait a day, and if it was cloudy 2 days in a row, then they'd just say, oh well, it's the new moon. It's Rosh Chodesh. Well, as I have tried to establish, the word Rosh Chodesh means head of the month. It doesn't have anything to do with the word Yereach, which means moon. So that's a third difficulty. It's not really precise. And then the other thing is, I mentioned the Karaites. They're the other calendar that some Nazarene follow. And the word Karaite simply means people who are eschewing all rabbinical tradition, and they try to stick strictly to the scriptures. And that's admirable, except for the fact that, of course, Karaites do not believe in Yahushua. They reject their Moshiach, just as most regular Jewish people do. But the problem is that they have this idea in their head, which, I can understand where they would have established this, that they need to go out and look at the barley and see if the barley is at a certain state of ripeness. And if that happens in combination with the moon thing, then okay, we can declare that we have Abib. The barley is Abib, and then the calendar can go forward. But again, it's not real precise. And Yahweh is precise in what he does. He isn't like slapdash. And there's all sorts of variables. I mean, I've had people tell me that you can even go to different parts of Israel, and the barley will look one way, in one part, because every part of the world has kind of like microclimates, and Israel is no exception. So the barley might be Abib in one part and not Abib in another part, and what do you do with that? So, what I'm about to propose is something that's I think a lot more scriptural and also a lot more precise. Now, as I said earlier, if we don't follow Rome, which we certainly don't want to do that, and we don't want to follow the rabbis, and I mean, I have the greatest respect for the rabbis, but a lot of times, since they rejected our Messiah roughly 2,000 years ago, the light has kind of gone out. And a lot of what they have attempted to do with their oral law, with the Mishnah and the Talmud, frankly, it's kind of messed up. And that's why we don't follow rabbinical takanot, the rabbinical rulings, what they call the halachot. Instead, we try to stick to the scriptures. So if we aren't following Rome, we aren't following the rabbis, and we aren't following the Karaites, what are we following? Well, what we're doing is we are following a solar calendar, because Yahweh says repeatedly that the sun is to rule over the day. I mean, that's pretty plain. So, as we mentioned in Genesis 1 verse 16, that is the mandate we have in the scriptures. Now, to unpack some of this, we're going to go to other ancient writings. And we understand that these writings are not scripture, but they are of profound historical value. Because most of these things are either contain Torah, or else they are mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures or in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. So, for example, we're going to look at the book of Jubilees, which is, very highly regarded. We're going to look at the book of Enoch, which is actually quoted in Jude, 1:14. Jude, who was one of the half-brethren of Yahushua, and therefore he should have known what he was talking about, said that Enoch prophesied, and then he gave forth 2 verses that are direct quotes from the book of Enoch. So obviously, and other biblical historians will agree that in the days of the apostles, in the days of Yahushua, the book of Enoch was very highly regarded. And in fact, to this day, the book of Enoch is still, as historically for 2,000 years, been in the Coptic Christian Bible, which is from North Africa. So we have the book of Enoch, and then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which of course were a profound find that was discovered over 60 years ago now. And they have an extraordinary treasure trove of information concerning the practices of the last 500 years or so before the time of Moshiach. So these ancient writings can help us understand further what's going on with these feasts. Now, in the book of Jubilees, 2 verse 9, it says this: "And Elohim appointed the sun to be a great sign on the earth for days, and for Sabbaths, and for months, and for feasts, and for years, and for jubilees, and for all the seasons of the years." Now that's pretty straightforward. The sun is how we are to determine when both the Sabbaths and the Moedim, the feast days, and also even the Jubilee years. So then the other thing we look at is in Enoch, and this is where it gets critical. Enoch 71 verse 24 says this. It states clearly that the year should be 364 days, and that it should start when the night is equal to the day. Now, we understand that today to mean the equinox. That's what the word equinox means, equal day, equal night. Now, Jubilees 6:38 also teaches that Yahweh's calendar year is only 364 days. Now, the Qumran community, which produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, many people used to think they were Essenes. Maybe they were. I mean, the scholars are divided on this, but they were definitely a very strict sect of Judaism from the time of John the Baptist and the time of Yahushua and a little before that. And they, again, adhered to a 364-day calendar. Now, prophetically, this is really interesting in the light of what's been going on in Israel for the last 2,000 years, meaning the people, not the land. Prophetically, Jubilees 6, verses 36 and 37 says this. It's a warning. "For there will be those who will assuredly make observations of the moon, how it disturbs the seasons and comes in from year to year 10 days too soon." Verse 37, "For this reason the years will come upon them when they will disturb the order and make an abominable day the day of testimony, and an unclean day a feast day. And they will confound all the days, the set apart with the unclean, and the unclean day with the set apart. For they will go wrong as to the months, and the Sabbaths, and the feasts, and the jubilees. Now that's pretty prophetic, because that is what has happened. Ever since Israel came back from Babylon, they have been using a lunar calendar, and it's disturbed the seasons. It has disturbed the calendar and the feasts and everything. So, and I mean, I'm not knocking them. They were doing the best they can with what they had after being stuck in a pagan land for 70 years. But we need to come back to what Abba Father has for us, instead of following men's traditions, whether they're Roman traditions or Jewish traditions or Karaite traditions. So with that in mind, the important thing I want you to understand from that teaching is the fact that it says that the moon calendar will end 10 days too soon. Now, what does that mean, really? Well, the lunar calendar is only 354 days. Now, that's a problem, because we all understand that the typical, understanding nowadays is that the year is 365 days. So that's like over a 10-day gap. How do we deal with that? Interestingly enough, and I know some of you people really get into numbers and how they work and everything. I think you need to know this. The number 354 is divisible by 6, which is the number of a man. It's the numerical sign of human effort, human intelligence, and human ego. The number 364, which is the number that all these different ancient sources tell us the calendar should be, the number 364 is divisible by 7. And if you do the division, it comes out to 52 weeks. 52 perfect weeks. And of course, that's what we see as being the year. And see, remember, all this flummoxing around with cloudy nights and barley and, this and that and the other thing, it's very imprecise. And we're told that Yahweh does all things well. And this lunar calendar is really, really badly off kilter, to the point, and I don't want to get too technical here, but that the rabbis have to do what they call an intercalary month. Now, the best way I can explain it is kind of like a leap month, if you will. And so roughly every 18, 19 years, they have to put a month in to reset everything. Otherwise, Passover, for example, would end up happening in the summer or the fall, which of course is totally off base. So they have to keep tinkering with the calendar. They have to keep adding this extra month every 19 years, give or take. And that's not Yahweh. That is not how he does things. He does things very well. And nowhere, absolutely nowhere in the Torah or in any of the Hebrew scriptures do we find any evidence, of a 13th intercalary month. It's just not in there. So what do you do with that? So, but if we want to take this out and not use this calendar, either the lunar one or the Gregorian one or the Karaite one, then what are we going to do? Well, let's look at this practically. How does this really work? Well, first of all, realize that the circle of the year has 360 degrees. Most people who have studied geometry know that. 90 days, so it's like 90 days in this year. 90 days for all 4 seasons, summer, fall, winter, and spring. And that works out perfectly to 360 days. Now, according to Enoch, 74 verses 1 through 4, there are 4 days added. These 4 chiefs, these 4 rulers, they're talked about, one for each season, to begin each season. But they are not included in the calculation of the year. And this is what brings the number of days up from 360 to 364. And it's perfect. There's 52 weeks in a year of exactly, 7 days each. And this is what, like, for example, in Deuteronomy 32:4, we read this about our Father in heaven. He is the rock. His work is perfect, for all his ways are judgment, an Elohim of truth, and without equity, just and right is he. Amen. Now, why would a divine being like that create a calendar that kept having to be tinkered with, and you have to insert months into, and all of this and that? It just doesn't make sense. So, with that in mind, virtually all the Torah communities, whether Nazarene or Jewish or whatever, Karaite, they all believe it's a given that Passover, Pesach, should take place in the spring. Fine. Now, Enoch 71 mentions, as I said earlier, that the beginning of the year should be equal day and equal night. So that would have to be the spring equinox. Now that varies a little bit from year to year. So the rabbis have a fixed calendar that they set up almost 1900 years ago, once they were kicked out of the land of Israel. And they have determined that Passover should be on the 10th of April this year. But that's just based on calculations that have nothing to do with the actual scriptures. We believe and recommend that it is scriptural to begin the new year one day after the equinox. So, the equinox is more dependable, it's easier to determine, and it fits better with both the Torah and also with these extra scriptural sources like the Qumran community, Jubilees, and Enoch. So, in this year, we see that Abib 1, the first day of the new year, would be March 22nd. Counting 14 days, as the scriptures say, into Abib would place Erev Pesach, Passover evening, at April 3rd, 2017. Now, obviously, if you're viewing this in a different year, the dates are going to be different. But for 2017, we are recommending people celebrate Pesach, the Seder dinner on the Erev of April 3rd. Then this will be followed by 8 days of matzah, unleavened bread, where you have no leaven in your house. Now, understand this. We're not saying if you don't do it this way that you're evil or whatever. We know we're all trying to figure these things out. But I've spent a lot of time, and Mary and I have spent much prayer, much interceding before Father in heaven to get this thing out to you. And we believe it's the best of our understanding. But again, if you believe differently, we're certainly not going to, call you a heretic or whatever, because we're all trying to work these things out. But that being said, I would recommend celebrating Pesach on the eve of April 3rd. Now, we already have a teaching on YouTube on what the vital importance is for Passover, for Pesach, for followers of Yahushua keeping this vital and most important of Moedim, of set-apart days in our Heavenly Father's calendar. So, it's our prayer that as we have set forth this explanation, that you would endeavor to keep Passover and the 8 days of unleavened bread, and purify yourself and make yourself ready for the soon coming King, Rabbi Melech Ha'edon Yahushua HaMashiach. And believe me, he's coming very soon. And we need to be a kahal, a congregation without spot and wrinkle. We need to be keeping his feast days, his moedim, which mean appointed times. They're times that he wants to get together with us and celebrate these feasts together as a set-apart family. And we want to be sure that we're getting the dates right to the best of our human understanding, buttressed by set-apart scriptures. So please take these things seriously. Don't keep Easter, keep Passover and the days of unleavened bread. It will be a tremendous blessing to you. Refer to our other video for details on how to keep Passover. And we wish the deepest and most profound blessings from our Heavenly Father for everybody who's listening during this most sacred time of year. Thank you again for listening to us, for supporting us. If you find this a blessing, please subscribe and share it. And please pray about supporting our ministry because we are entirely a faith ministry. We do not monetize this site in any way, so we're entirely dependent upon free will offerings. We really appreciate you. We pray again that you are blessed by what we've shared, and shalom, shalom. Shalom, brethren. This is a brief appendix to the talk I just gave. I just want to explain that we are going to have a calendar available on our website, withoneaccord.org, and that we're going to have some more teachings on this. But if you have questions, feel free to contact us, because I know this may be new material for many of you, but we are going to have more to say about this. It's not as complicated as it sounds, nor is the feast itself, the Seder meal of Passover, as complex. You can make it as complex as you wish, but it isn't necessarily. A lot of the things that are in it are not really in the Torah. We explain some of that. We're going to do more on this. But for now, just go to our website where we will publish the calendar as we understand it for the spring feast of 2017. Again, thank you so much. Please pray for us, and shalom, shalom.